From Hamilton Place Strategies in Washington, D.C., this is the HPS Insights Podcast.
Welcome to HPS Insights, a podcast from Hamilton Place Strategies analyzing the current events impacting the business and political communities. I'm your host today, Bryan DeAngelis, a partner here at HPS, and I'm joined by a good friend and one of our clients, Craig Salm. Craig Salm is the Chief Legal Officer for Grayscale, and you've been doing a lot of work down here in Washington over the past couple months, and we're going to dive into all of that, crypto, ETFs, but let's just start at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to Grayscale.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me, Bryan.
Of course.
So I started my journey to Grayscale, I guess, in law school when I was a law student there and discovered this thing called Bitcoin.
Okay.
I learned about it because I read a lot of tech journals like Wired Magazine and things like that, and was reading a story about something called the Silk Road, which you may or may not have heard about. It was an early application that used Bitcoin to power its marketplace, which was for goods, both licit and illicit. And more so than the marketplace, I was really intrigued by how Bitcoin was being used to finance transactions that were taking place on it. And I wanted to learn more, and so I started to actually take computer science programs to better understand how these underlying data structures called blockchains, which is what records Bitcoin transactions and their history and verifies things, how that worked at like a very deep computer science level. And
around what year was this?
Well, when I give the answer, you're going to be like, wait, so did you buy a lot of Bitcoin?
Yeah, right.
It was in 2011, and to answer to get ahead of that question, the answer is no. I was still in law school, so Bummer. Paying off. Well, I wouldn't be here if that had happened.
Fair.
Wouldn't be here doing this lovely podcast. So I did not because I was still paying off law school debts and things like that, and wasn't in a position to be investing in this very speculative, even more speculative back then than it is now, asset and technology. So it was really more of a intellectual investment. Started learning about how the technology works, how it was being used. I was in law school, so wanted to understand what were the legal and political considerations there. And so just stayed up to speed on what was going on. You may not know this, but the way law school works is kind of interesting in that if you want to have one of these big law jobs in New York or California or one of those locations, you kind of get that job after your first year of grades because that dictates where you land for your summer associate position.
Your internship, basically.
Yeah, it's essentially an internship. They call it a summer associate position. But you most likely will end up there after you graduate law school because they want to bring on, upcoming grads and have them have a good experience and meet the partners and things like that.
Right.
So I got an offer at Paul Weiss and essentially knew I was going to go there after law school. And that was a really great opportunity because it just has such a vast corporate practice and gave me exposure to a lot of different types of clients and industries and practice areas. I wasn't doing anything Bitcoin or crypto related.
I was just about to ask, were they doing a lot of crypto at that time?
Yeah, they were not, but nor was any law firm. This was back in 2013 when I started there. But that experience was great because I really learned how to be a good corporate lawyer, which is what I was very much focused on. So I was getting involved in M&A and finance and investment management and capital markets, knowing that skill set is what I would want to use when I eventually would leave, which at that time I decided was to break into the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency space in some capacity. I had one year where I spent it at Apollo on secondment, which was a really unique experience because it offered me the opportunity to go in-house and see what it was like to be a lawyer there. And that experience really crystallized for me that I wanted to be in-house somewhere, not at a law firm, because I really valued being able to work with all the departments, not just legal, but compliance and operations and the traders and the salespeople. And
I know communications is your favorite.
I was getting to that as the one I love working with the most. And the very close connection between legal and communications.
That's right.
So then I went back to Paul Weiss after secondment, sat down and put together a list of every Bitcoin, crypto, blockchain, distributed ledger technology, because that's what people were calling it back then, companies in New York. And Grayscale was one of the companies that I got connected to. And it was really the perfect place for me to land because it's the perfect marriage of my strong intellectual interest in Bitcoin and crypto and blockchain technology married with the investment management, capital markets experience that I gained at Paul Weiss.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so that was January 2018, and it's been an amazing experience since then.
Yeah, I bet. So tell us a little bit more about Grayscale. What's their role in the broader crypto space?
Yeah. So Grayscale is a digital currency asset manager. We're the largest in the world, managing about $30 billion, give or take, across a family of 17 digital asset products. So those are holding actual coins. And then one newly launched equity ETF called Grayscale Future of Finance Fund. And our mission is really to bring access and exposure to the digital currency asset class in the form of a security, which is just a very familiar, transparent, traditional type of way to get investment exposure. Our clients are institutional investors, more regulated investors, pensions, endowments, sovereigns that want this exposure, but because of legal compliance, risk reasons, or comfort, or things their advisors or investors are saying can't get the actual direct exposure. But what they can do is invest in a security that gives that exposure to them. So that's really our offering. We launched in 2013 with our Grayscale Bitcoin Trust. And since then, it's become the largest publicly traded Bitcoin fund in the world. It's holding about 3.4% of all Bitcoin outstanding. It has hundreds of millions of dollars of daily trading volume, over 850,000 investors across all 50 states. And it's really become a great way for investors who want that Bitcoin exposure to invest in it through that traditional security.
My understanding, working with you guys now for a little bit, that trust was always set up to be an ETF. And there are obviously some investor disadvantages to it not yet being an ETF. Explain that to our listeners.
Yeah, that's a great point. The U.S. is unique right now in that we're one of the more developed countries that do not yet have a Bitcoin, let alone any other cryptocurrency ETF. And so what Grayscale has done is offered products that really give investors the next closest thing available for that digital asset exposure based on the current state of U.S. regulations. And so what we've devised is a 4-stage product lifecycle where each stage of our products results in them becoming more accessible to more types of investors, with the 4th and final stage being conversion into an ETF. So the first stage for our products is a private placement under Rule 506C, which is an exemption from SEC registration. And that offering is initially only available to accredited investors. Mm-hmm. And those investors have a statutory 1-year lockup period. Yep. So in terms of access and exposure, it's the most restrictive way that you can invest in the product. And you might say, well, why can you do that? But why don't we have a Bitcoin ETF? The reason is a policy choice that our regulators have made in that they're okay with accredited investors, which are wealthy, have a certain level of income and sophistication, and also if they're able to hold on and bear that risk for at least a year as just the initial offering. And then afterwards, they'd be more okay with other non-accredited investors getting the exposure. So that's the first phase, the private placement. The second phase is something innovative that we've done, is develop a public quotation on the over-the-counter markets for the shares in the product that were originally created in the private placement that have been held for 1 year and can now be freely traded. So just thinking more accessible, more types of investors. Right. Retail investors can access that product. There's no lockup periods. But importantly, it's not an ETF at that stage. And so what that does is result in the products trading at what have historically been premiums and discounts. The third stage that we do is make the products SEC reporting. And what that does is make them more transparent, more robust for our investors that really need that type of reporting standards and disclosure for their own investment risk committees, compliance folks, and so on. And we do that voluntarily because we know that this is what our investors really want and deserve.
I was just going to ask that. This is not something the SEC is mandating. You guys are.
Right. We're doing this, raising our hand. We want to be subject to heightened reporting standards.
A little bit of ask permission, not forgiveness
and that's
strategy.
Yeah, exactly. And that's definitely the theme that Grayscale has followed throughout our history of, getting in front of regulators, helping them better understand this asset class so that they can do their job better of protecting their investors, consumers, while also still balancing that with allowing the innovation to flourish in the U.S. So that's the third stage. And then the fourth and final stage is conversion into an ETF, at which point the product will be as accessible as possible to investors, traded on an exchange, and then also better track its underlying assets because you have this creation and redemption mechanism that you get with an ETF.
So let's jump into that. And it's a bit of a niche issue maybe to a wider audience, but probably a lot of our listeners have been following this pretty closely. The SEC last fall agreed or approved futures ETFs for Bitcoin. That seemed to signal to the market that, okay, the SEC is getting more comfortable with this. I think a lot of folks expected Gary Gensler, professor at MIT on blockchain, to come in and have, candidly, way more understanding of this space than some of the other potential regulators. And we've seen a number of futures ETFs approved, but we're not yet there on the spot ETF. And the SEC has rejected several applicants, and you guys are up at the end of July. Where are things right now in this kind of consideration with the SEC?
Yep. So we started this process along with several other Bitcoin ETF applicants, back in 2013 technically, but the real first wave of applicants in front of the SEC was in 2016 into 2017. And at that time, we were seeking to convert our flagship product, Grayscale Bitcoin Trust, into a ETF. There were several other issues at the time that were looking to create new Bitcoin ETFs. And there are really two types of products then and today. There's ones that hold actual physical Bitcoin or spot Bitcoin, like what GBTC does today, as well as products that hold a derivative of Bitcoin, Bitcoin futures. And back then, the SEC either denied or told to withdraw, or in the case of Grayscale, voluntarily withdrew the applications because of what the SEC cited to be the potential for fraud or manipulation in the underlying Bitcoin markets. And if that's the concern, then it makes total sense why the SEC would not be comfortable with both the spot and the futures-based products, since they're both priced based on those underlying markets. And so Grayscale withdrew our application. This was also when we went to the SEC and said, we understand that you're not comfortable with the ETF product because it would be more valuable to retail investors, but would you be okay with us making the product SEC reporting? And over a couple of back and forth, they eventually said, yes, we would review that application. And that was a really good process for us to get in front of the SEC on, because it allowed us to, in that context, talk to them more about Bitcoin, its use cases, its market structure, how we think about custody, how we think about accounting for Bitcoin on our financial statements, enhancing our risk disclosures, things like that.
Right.
So we've always had a really good engagement with the SEC of helping them and be an educational resource. But that was back in 2018, and then as you mentioned, last year we had the first not spot-based Bitcoin ETF approved, but a futures-based ETF. And that was a really exciting and interesting event. Exciting because any level of more access for investors to Bitcoin is positive. But at the same time, it was interesting because if you recall that the issue for the SEC all along had been around the underlying pricing.
Right.
Well, how could they be okay with a futures-based ETF but not a spot-based ETF, since they're both priced based on the underlying markets?
Yeah. Now, their argument on this is around the 33 and 40 Act. So can you explain to our listeners a little bit about what that is?
Yeah. So there's a couple of reasonings the SEC has provided for why they were starting to treat the futures-based product differently from the spot-based product. And I would argue that those are really distinctions without a difference. But there's two of them. One is that the futures-based product holds CME Bitcoin futures, whereas the spot-based product holds actual Bitcoin. And so the argument there is that because these CME Bitcoin futures are trading on CME, which is regulated by the CFTC, there's more investor protections there in contrast to spot-based Bitcoin. And while it's true that there is different type of regulation there, that regulation on the futures exchange is not going to do anything to, if you're concerned about it, prevent fraud or manipulation in the underlying Bitcoin markets.
Correct. Right.
So distinction without a difference. The other distinction they've cited in the past has been around the regulations of the two types of ETFs. So the futures-based ETFs prior to just a couple of weeks ago,
right,
were all regulated under the Investment Company Act of 1940, whereas ETFs like GBTC would be regulated under the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 and Securities Act of 1933. And so 40 Act, 34 Act, 33
right.
Act. The 40 Act
There won't be a quiz later.
There will not be. There might be, though.
Yeah.
The 40 Act does have added investor protections, but those protections are at the fund level as opposed to the underlying market level. So what the 40 Act does is require things like certain types of accounting, restrictions on borrowing and lending, qualified custody, restrictions on conflicts of interest, board independence, which are all good for investor protection. But again, those are not going to do anything to impact the underlying Bitcoin markets. So you have these two distinctions. We argue that in the context of Bitcoin ETF approvals, those are distinctions without a difference. Nonetheless, it's what the arguments the SEC
right.
has made. And our attorneys at Davis Polk have filed letters in the context of our ETF application arguing why those are not meaningful enough distinctions in this case.
So they were doing that for a few months. Let's
yeah.
just kind of break this down. So I think it was November when the futures ETFs were approved. Forgive me if I'm off a little there. And Davis Polk makes the argument there's, a distinction without a difference here between right. 33 and 40. But then I think you were about to get to this a few minutes ago. A couple weeks ago, Tucrium gets approved as a futures ETF, but under the 40 Act.
Under the 34
Act, excuse
right.
me.
Right.
So now there's presumably no difference.
Yeah. So this is another interesting technical point about securities laws, which probably will show up on the exam later.
Right. I've already failed that last one. But.
With an ETF that holds futures, you can elect to have it regulate under the 40 Act or the 34 and 33 Act. It's just a matter of what the issuer chooses to do based on its own business objectives. Before this Tucrium ETF that you mentioned, all the prior futures ETFs that had been approved were regulated under the 40 Act. And so the SEC was saying, we're approving these because the 40 Act just has this different standard, and we're not being inconsistent by approving those 40 Act funds and continuing to disapprove the spot-based 34 and 33 Act funds. With Tucrium, it was really interesting because they were the first example of a futures ETF that was not seeking to be regulated under the 40 Act. And so what that did was put the SEC in a position where they could either deny it and continue to uphold this distinction of the 40 Act versus
right.
34 and 33, or approve it and then come up with some other justification. And what they ended up doing was approving it. So what we have now is basically a path that's been paved that is leading into what we believe should be approval of spot-based ETFs. We had 40 Act futures approved in November.
Right.
We had 34 Act, 33 Act approved in April. And now what we believe should happen is having spot-based approved under 34 and 33 Act.
And my question on this front, and we've talked a little bit about this off the air, but is this just the SEC getting comfortable with where Bitcoin and crypto is going, and we could pull in a whole bunch of other things, the executive order, other stuff. Right. But it does seem to be probably based on the education that Grayscale and other companies are doing. The SEC has just slowly kind of naturally evolved on this and getting more and more comfortable, which to me too would lead to a natural conclusion of the spot ETF is next.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. This is a new asset class. It was invented a little over a decade ago. It's the first asset class that was invented since the invention of the ETF itself. And if you look back at ETF history, even more well understood assets like gold, the gold ETF took several years of the initial application to ultimately be approved. And so it's understandable why it would take this long for a Bitcoin ETF to be approved. And to the SEC's credit, they've been very open and willing to engage with us and other issuers to better understand the asset class. I mentioned the engagement we had with them in the context of becoming SEC reporting.
Right.
And their questions have become very sophisticated. I always say that they have a tough job of striking that balance of, one, protecting investors, but also allowing the innovation to flourish. And so it really is just a matter of time. What's also going on now in the context of our efforts to convert into an ETF is this open comment letter period.
Yeah, let's get into this. So just pausing there because I want to give you the opportunity to give the full explanation. So you guys have been pretty public over the last several months of the need for this. The SEC is in a comment letter period now running through July 6th where they're asking the public to weigh in on this. Talk a little bit about what Grayscale is doing, both with investors, but also you're doing a lot here in Washington as well.
Right. Yeah. So because the Bitcoin ETF would require a new rule under the SEC's rules, it requires this open comment letter period where the SEC is reviewing the application and also inviting in the public to submit their own commentary of why they think or don't think the SEC should approve of this ETF. And that's just a great demonstration of the democratic process at work because it's showing regulators want to take in the information, make sure they're assessing this, and really putting a lot of thought into it because it is an important and difficult question. So that process was kicked off when we refiled our 19B4 last October. It opened up this 240-day review period where the SEC is taking in comment letters, reviewing them. Grayscale, knowing that this is a really important process, but also knowing that our investors and the public maybe don't know that they can be a part of it, started this campaign to really activate our base and say you can be a part of this process and have your voice heard. So we created a website, grayscale.com/comment, that explains the issues, makes it really simple for anybody visiting that website to click on a button, opens up a window where they can email the SEC.
Yep.
We've created a little template just to make it easier, but everyone's obviously invited in to put their own commentary in it.
Yeah, and you're giving people a lot of information. The Davis Polk arguments are up there, some of the other back and forth.
So we've launched this campaign. We have advertising in Union Station here in D.C., Penn Station back in New York, because it's important to make sure that this is all known. And we've been extremely encouraged by the response that we've received. I checked the SEC website before this podcast, and there have been over 4,000 letters submitted by the public. Yeah, as far as comment letters go in a regulatory open comment letter period, that's a lot.
Yeah.
And we've been going through the letters over the last couple of months to see what's coming in. It's a really good mix of both our investors as well as market participants, academics, and we've really started to see three themes arise through all these comment letters. One is around investor protection. So we already have investors in GBTC. The AUM is in the tens of billions of dollars, but because it's not an ETF, today it's trading at a discount because you don't have this creation and redemption mechanism that I mentioned to arb against premiums and discounts. So that's billions of dollars of actual investor capital that's being trapped in the fund that's not able to be realized because it's not an ETF. So these investors are saying, hey, SEC, I'm invested in this fund because I want Bitcoin exposure through this wrapper. How are you protecting me by not allowing it to convert into an ETF, given that it would allow it to better track NAV? It's a large fund. There's a lot of investors behind it. There's actual liquidity behind it. It's SEC reporting. It's accomplished all these things that an ETF is able to do, but becoming an actual ETF. So that's one of the themes that we're seeing.
Let me jump in and explain NAV to our listeners.
Okay.
If they don't fully get that.
Good point. So NAV is a net asset value, and all it means is the actual value of underlying assets in a given fund. So today, let's say GBTC has $30 billion of net asset value of its underlying Bitcoins. Because it's trading at, let's say, a 25% discount, that's over $7 billion of value that's not being reflected in the price of the shares.
That's essentially lost to those investors.
Well, for now. So there's a lot of – once it eventually does convert into an ETF, because of the creation redemption mechanism inherent to any well-functioning ETF, the discount that it's currently trading at would trade back up to NAV because that's just how the ETF arb mechanism works. So we're actually seeing a lot of investors that are buying GBTC because they know that eventually it will convert. And if you have a long enough outlook, which a lot of our investors do around this asset class, because it is new, because it is a new technology that is still being explored, they are long-term holders for a lot of their cases. So that's the first theme, investor protection. The second theme we're seeing is around America competitiveness and leadership in crypto and Web3.
Yep.
And that very much is bolstered by this White House executive order from a couple of months ago, where you had for the first time the president and the White House saying, we want America to lead in this space. And so the line of reasoning is, well, what better way to do that than by further bringing Bitcoin into the regulatory perimeter through products like a spot-based Bitcoin ETF. So it's the second theme around America competitiveness. And then the third argument is what I've really touched on around this Davis-Polk argument, these legal arguments, which is that we already have a futures ETF. How do we not have a spot-based ETF, given the underlying concerns historically have been around the underlying pricing?
Right. And there's some connection there between those last two, right? If America wants to lead, if the President of the United States and the White House are recognizing this isn't some passing fad, as some people like to believe with crypto, but this is real, and this is a set of assets that you would think an ETF would be a natural next tool and next step for folks.
Yeah, and by not approving a spot ETF, it's not like Americans aren't going to be able to get their exposure elsewhere. They'll go to other cryptocurrency exchanges, which may or not be in the U.S., which means they may not be as regulated or protective. So you're not keeping investors from getting the Bitcoin exposure by not approving an ETF, which is another reason why the approval should go through. And in the meantime, we have other countries around the world with robust financial markets that have already approved these products. You have Canada, you have Germany, you have Switzerland, Australia this week is going to list their first both Bitcoin and Ethereum ETFs. Right. So we're continuing to fall behind, and that's a reason why we think it's really important to allow these approvals to happen.
Well, we have a few minutes left. So final thought, let's say we get to July 6th and the SEC denies the application. What happens next from there?
Yeah, so one potential option is something that we've been public about, which would be a lawsuit against the SEC under something called the Administrative Procedure Act, or the APA, and the Exchange Act. And the argument behind those two acts are, under the APA, which governs how regulators govern, you cannot be arbitrary and capricious in your treatment of, in our case, investment products. And so, as I mentioned, it's inconsistent to be okay with futures and not spot. And then under the Exchange Act, it is essentially just unfair discrimination against these two types of investment products.
Right.
So one potential avenue would be a lawsuit against the SEC. But I think what's important to realize about that is it's not like a lawsuit where there's animosity against somebody.
I was just going to say, this is, people hear lawsuit and they get defensive, they get aggressive, but this is a pretty standard next step for these kind of
It's a standard option that's available and is a reflection of just how the U.S. democratic process works. We have three branches. We have Congress, which writes the laws, the executive branch, which the SEC falls into, which enforces the laws, and then the courts, which interpret those laws. And right now, if we were to get denied, then we would have a disagreement with how those laws are being interpreted by the SEC and us. And we could go to Congress and say, can you rewrite these, amend these for what we think is more sensible in the context of Bitcoin ETFs? Or we can go to the courts and see if they interpret it differently. So it's just one available option that we would have to us. And, it's not unheard of. Regulators, get sued by those that they regulate. It happens. It's not as if it changes their posture with respect to one another.
We see it all the time in this.
We have a respectful relationship with the SEC. And as I mentioned before, it's a difficult situation they're in with this asset class, which is new. And they want to really strike that balance of protecting investors while also allowing it to flourish.
Right. Thanks for coming on and explaining this. As I mentioned, a lot of folks are paying attention to this in Congress and in the media. So I'm sure there'll be a lot more in the next few weeks as we get to July 6th. But really appreciate you taking a few minutes.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Brian.
And thank you to all of our listeners. As always, this is HPS Insights. We'll be back again next week. And in the meantime, you can check out our show on HamiltonPlaceStrategies.com, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and follow along with the work we're doing on Twitter at HPS Insights. I'm Bryan DeAngelis. Thanks all for listening.
Thank you for listening to the HPS Insights podcast, produced by Hamilton Place Strategies. For the latest updates, follow us on Twitter at HPS Insights and follow us on the web at HamiltonPlaceStrategies.com.